Welcome to part 3 of the Casting Your Own Resin Car series. This section we're going to be talking about actually casting the cars and how to use the resins. The resins are you can get them from Alumilite, you can get them from Smooth On, Hobby Silicones, any number of Micromark sells the Smooth On products rebranded, so you can get them from Micromark. There's a lot of different sources. Most of them are these type of resins. There are also epoxies. Epoxies are a little bit thicker, a little bit harder to get into small spaces, and they're a little bit more hazardous to deal with. So I would suggest using the casting resins instead. The things that you want to look at when you choose a casting resin is the cure time and or the pot life and the cure time. For example, this Alumilite RC3 has a 3-minute pot life and cures in 7 minutes. You don't want to get too short of a pot life because you won't have enough time to get the resin mixed, poured into the mold, and then do all the things you need to do with the mold before it starts to set. You don't want to get too long of a pot life because then it'll just slow down your production. So I found somewhere in the 3 to 5 minute range is usually pretty good for the resin. And then the actual cure time, the cure time really doesn't make that much difference except for the amount of, if you have to pressurize it, it's the amount of time you need it pressurized. Otherwise, the big deal with the cure time is just how soon you can turn over your molds and how long it takes you to make a series of castings. If you have, for example, the RC3 has a 7-minute cure time, so you can turn over and prepare and reuse a mold about every 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes with a 7-minute cure time. So that's a real quick time for you to get your molds, and you can cast a lot more pieces if you have a shorter cure time. When you mix the resins are at least these type are usually 2-part mixed equal parts. They are water, consistency of water, very fluid, very light, so they flow into stuff. That's very good. There are 2 parts to them, a part A and a part B. This is part A and part B. Also, just as a safety issue for both the RTV and the resins, when you actually handle them, wear gloves. They can be skin irritants. You want to make sure you don't get them in your eyes, so if you need to wear eye protection because they can be eye irritants. They don't really give off that many fumes, so you don't have to worry too much about the inhalation issues. Just make sure you cast in a well-ventilated room and you should be okay. If you have a small vent fan, it's not going to hurt anything to vent it, but like I say, they don't really give off any kind of noticeable odors that I have seen. But the 2 parts, A and B, what you will do is you'll pour equal parts. Since these castings take very small pieces, or very small amounts of resin to cast, for example, one of these car sides castings will take 5 grams of each one of these things. That's a very small amount. You need to have a very accurate scale. I like to use a triple beam balance scale. You can use the little electronic scales. Either way works. It just has to be accurate enough to measure this accurately. A little kitchen scale, the springy kitchen scales, probably not accurate enough for these purposes. I would get one of the electronics or a triple beam scale. With these small quantities, you want to be able to get the replicate the quantity of A and B and make sure that they're the equal amount so you don't get a bad mix. So we'll put these back. Now, once you get the the resins poured out in the amount that you need, and sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out how much you need. For example, this one uses 13 grams, and this one uses 22 grams of resin. Each one of these, this takes about 12 total, and this takes about 10 total. So what I do is I put my little cup, I measure them out in these little plastic cups, 1 ounce souffle cups. I put that on there. I pour in my resin when I get the correct amount of resin poured. So I'll have A and B. I don't mix them on the scale. I mix them, pour them in separate cups. Now, if you want, there are dyes. This is brown and this is black. You can put a little tiny drop of the of a dye into the part A, the clear fluid with aluminite, and mix that up, and that way you can get, instead of getting the standard tan or white with smooth on resin is white, instead of getting the standard color, you can dye them different colors. So I can get, here's a dark gray and here's a brown. So if you would like to do that, there are also additives that you can mix in this with the part A resin, and there are many different types of additives. Most of them are some sort of a powder. You can get powdered tungsten. That'll make it heavy, which would be good if you want to need weight for a small resin object. The other thing you can add is you can add glass beads. That'll make it lighter and softer. If you there's also marble powder, bronze powder, aluminum powder, all different things. If you make the additives in there, it will add weight typically. It will add density. It will make the resin thicker so it won't flow into the cracks and crevices. And it will, when you drill into it, it will dull your drills more than just the straight resin. Now, once I get it measured out, if I put any additives that I want, I will pour the part A and B together. I will use a popsicle stick that I clip the end off to make a nice square so I can get in the corners. I will stir this all up and stir it sufficiently. Once the two things touch, the pot life begins. That 3-minute clock begins. Mix it all up, and then I will pour it into the molds. I pour it in a very thin stream. The thin stream helps break up bubbles. So pour it all into the thin stream. A lot of times I will keep a small mold around, so if I have any extra, I can then pour in a small detail part with the extra surplus resin. But once you get the resin in there, into the mold, then you can take a toothpick or a wire or something and chase out any bubbles that you see that are floating around in there. You can move around in all the little cracks and crevices and the undercuts and make sure that you get the resin in there, and just make sure that you're as bubble free as you can get it. However, if you've got an enclosed mold, like a 2-piece mold, or in this case a squish mold or something like that, you can't see where the bubbles are in there to chase them out once you put the thing together. So then you have to do another strategy. If you have a enclosed mold and you want to get the bubbles out, instead of using vacuum that you used for the rubber, you can use pressure. And this is a pressure tank. It is what's commonly called a paint pot. It is used for painters. They put in a gallon of paint in here, and it's got a siphon, and you pressurize this and it squirts the paint out for a spray gun. I've modified it by adding a T in here. I've got a pressure regulator on the input side, a valve to control the airflow, and then a pressure over here that when I close the valve I can see what the pressure is in the tank. This is connected to a regular old air compressor set at about 40 psi. The limit of this pressure tank is 50 psi. You do not want to exceed that. You want to make sure that you are below that. You want to inspect the paint pot, these bolts, the hinges for the dogs, and the eye bolts of the dogs to make sure there are no cracks, because once you pressurize this to about 40-50 psi, it's basically a bomb. So you want to make sure that everything is tight and there are no cracks in it where nothing's going to break. So with this paint pot, after I pour my resin into my mold, so I have all mixed my resin, I've put any additives, I poured it in the mold, I tried to get out any bubbles in the parts that I could see, I put in the male portion of it to squish the mold. I now take the mold and I set it in my tank. I put the dogs on. And as you tighten the dogs down, you need to keep going around and make sure that all the dogs are tight, because as you tighten one dog down, it will loosen another one. So now they're all tight, and now I've got my pressure attached to it. I can open up the pressure valve and pressurize this tank. This whole process, from the time you mix till the time you get it in here and pressurize it, has to be less than the pot life of the resin. So if it's 3-minute pot life, you have to be able to mix the resin, pour it in to the mold, chase out any of the bubbles, get the mold assembled, get it into the pressure pot, secure the pressure pot, and pressurize it in less than 3 minutes. That's why you don't want a really short pot life if you're doing a complex mold. This is not necessary if you're doing a flat mold. It is just a really handy thing to do if you've got an enclosed mold, like a big 2-piece mold or a squish mold. It's one of those little extra things that you can have. With a flat mold, once you get all the resin in and you get the bubbles chased out, you want the back of the flat mold to be as absolutely flat as possible. In order to do that, what I've done is I've taken some pieces of plastic that are intended for glazing. They're like a plexiglass used for storm windows and that type of thing. You can buy them at a big box store. And I spray it with the mold release because I don't want the resin to stick to it. And then I fill up my mold, and then I take the plastic and I push down onto the mold, squidging out the resin ahead of it. And that hopefully will keep bubbles from being trapped underneath of it by starting at one end and pushing to the other, and put that on there. If you press it down hard enough, you can clearly see the mold color through the glass or through the plastic. That means you've got a really thin flash on your mold. For example, on this end of this mold, you can see the magic marker behind through the flash. That means you've got a really thin flash, and you can, and for example on this one, you really can't see it as well. That's got a lot thicker flash. If you get really thin flash, you don't need to worry about sanding it off. It makes the cleanup much easier. It makes using the part much easier. You get a much more consistent piece. So once I get the flat molds, I get this piece here. Now I have a consistent thickness on my pieces. Then you have to get the flat, the backing piece on before that 3 minute is up. The resin that you're using is a exothermic resin. What it does is as it cures, it generates heat, and the heat causes it to cure. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The problem is that in these thin castings, like we like to use for the model railroad stuff, instead of a big block, the casting, often there isn't enough resin in there to generate enough heat for it to fully cure all by itself. So we have to add heat and heat up the casting to make sure that it fully cures, and even the thin areas are warmed up. To facilitate curing that, I made myself my own oven, which is basically a 2 turkey pans, baking pans. I cut the rim off of the one pan and cut a hole in the top, and so it will sit on top of the other pan. And then I have a incandescent light that I can put over that hole. The heat from the incandescent light goes into the pan, heats up the interior to about 120 to 150 degrees, and that extra added warmth will help cure the castings. So after the mold is fully cured for the 7 to 10 minutes, something like that, in the pressure tank, or after I get the backing on, what I will do is open up my oven and stick my mold, or stick the mold that came out of the 2-piece mold that came out of the pressure tank. I put it in here and put that over it and get it warmed. Now, with the backing, I found that I had an issue. If you'll notice, turn this off. If you'll notice, when I pick up the mold, because it's this rubber, it tends to droop. So what I did was, I cut some pieces of masonite, scrap masonite, as little supports so that I can pick up the mold and it doesn't bend when I pick it up to put it into the oven. What happens is if you put it, pick it up and it bends, if you'll notice with this one, you can see the void that was created when the mold pulled away from the plastic backing sheet. It created this void in the back of the mold of the casting and rendered the casting not very good. So I will leave it in here and just let it warm for about another 10 minutes or so to get it fully cured. At the end of 10 minutes, we will take it out. Once the castings are out of the oven, then they can be removed from the mold. Now you've got a choice here. You can remove them from the mold while they're still warm, or you can wait till the mold cools off and then remove them from the mold when they're cool. There's a difference. When you remove them from the mold when they are warm, the resin is very pliable when it's warm. As a matter of fact, if you have a warped casting, you can heat it in about up to about 100, 120 degrees, something like that, and it will soften and you can flatten it back out. So if I take it out warm, it's going to be pretty pliable. Since I want flat castings, what I will do is when I pull it out, if it's warm, is I will trim off any big flash around the edges, and then I will set it on a glass plate and press it down on the glass plate and let it finish cooling to room temperature on the glass plate. That way it will cool flat. If you are using something like this that's a hollow casting. That can be a little bit tougher. Here, we'll use this one. If you're pulling it out of like a mold like this, because when you pull it out, first off, to get it out of this mold, you're going to want to take the mold apart. And for example, I have 3 little pins at the bottom here, and I take it out of this mold frame, and then I can bend the mold away and pull the thing out. Normally, if it's got large undercuts, that means it's going to warp the casting, so then you have to get it straightened out. One way to do that is to take the male portion and put the male portion into the center of the casting, and that will cause it to reform itself. Otherwise, you have to carefully get it lined up and then let it sit someplace to cool. The alternative is that when you let it cool and take it out of the mold, you basically have to bend the mold away from it and pull the hardened casting out. That can sometimes be easier. It's more wear and tear on the molds. And if you've got this type of a mold and you pull that out, let's see here. I'm going to remove this. When you pull this out of here, when you start bending this mold, and this had large undercuts, because remember this was the one that had the large undercuts on the end. So pulling those large undercuts out with a cold mold, it will really stretch and tear, and as a result, it actually tore from all that stress of pulling those large undercuts out. It actually tore the end of the mold off and wrecked this mold for use. Also, there were a bunch of tears in the ends of the mold. You might be able to see some down in here. There's a bunch of tears in there that gave you a bad casting. So those are the 2 things you have to think about. If you can get it out while it's warm, it's much easier on the mold. The problem with getting it out warm is it is then soft, and you have to get it flattened back out. Once it does cool and you have it, you need to clean the thing. You can use a chemical. There's one called Bestine, which is a rubber cement solvent. You can clean this in Bestine. It'll remove all the solvents and the mold releases and all that other good stuff, any kind of silicone oils. Or else I use a lot of times Ajax, and use a toothbrush and scrub it with Ajax cleansing powder, and that usually will cut all the mold releases off of there. That way it can be glued and painted. Well, hopefully this has answered some of your questions. What we're going to do next is I'm going to reset the camera a little bit, and we're going to actually make a casting. Okay, we're going to now make a casting. I have my 2 little cups for the pieces. I have my molds that I have sprayed on the backing sheet, and on the mold I've sprayed my mold release. I'm going to turn on the oven to start it heating. So we'll take urethane part A. I've got my scale set for 5 grams. One of the nice things about the Alumilite bottles is they've got these really cool pour spouts, which make it really easy to pour. As you can see, these bottles are almost empty because I've been doing a lot of casting lately, and so I have really been using the heck out of the things. Here we're going to measure out our part B. And we're going to do 5 grams of part B. Wearing gloves, since I'm handling this stuff. So now we're going to mix the part A and part B. I'm not going to put any dyes or additives into this for this example. Take my... Now as you stir and mix this up, it's going to get a little cloudy, and then as it gets all mixed up, it will turn clear again. Then we will pour this into the mold. You pour it in a very thin stream into the deepest parts, and try and get it into the deepest parts and let it fill up into the mold. There we go. Get that all filled. We're going to put the end beams. Fill them up, and then we're going to put this. This looks like this was a pretty good pour. It doesn't look like I've got any too many bubbles. Here's a bubble in this. We'll get it out of the way. Get all up into the little. Make sure we have chased out any bubbles, especially in these little areas where the bubbles are want to hide. So we make sure we've got the bubbles out. So we're good on the bubbles. And now we're going to put the flat back on here. I take it and press on there and gently squidge it down. Now, as you can see at this, you can clearly see the rubber color through there. That means that I've got a very thin flash on there. So now we're going to pick this up using the carrier. Drop it in the oven, and then I will wait, let it bake for 10 minutes. And time is up, so we can now take this out, turn this off because we don't need it, and we'll take out the casting. You can see how thin the flash is around the casting on here. That it's been very thin, and that. So let's take off the backing piece. And there we go. Excellent. And you can see how flexible it is because it's still warm, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to cut off some of the large flash here. And then I'm going to put this down on the glass sheet. And there I have a successful casting of a sides, ends, and an end beam for a gondola. 2 more of those castings and a underframe, and I have another gondola. Thank you for watching. Hope this helped encourage you to try your own resin casting. Bye-bye.